llámame, yeah. Todos mis amigos dicen que eres mi adicción. Ahora simplemente sé que tienen la razón. Aunque no estemos juntos, yo estaré pensando en ti. No te vayas así, no te vayas así. No te vayas, por favor, que te llevas mi corazón y no sé qué hay que hacer para volverte a tener. Todos mis amigos dicen que eres mi adicción. Ahora simplemente sé que tiene la razón. Aunque no estemos juntos, ya estaré pensando en ti. No te vayas así, no te vayas así. Todos mis amigos dicen que eres mi adicción. Ahora simplemente sé que tienen la razón. Aunque no estemos juntos, yo estaré pensando en ti. No te vayas así, no te vayas así. No te vayas, no te vayas, no te vayas, por favor. Que yo sin ti yo no sé ser feliz. No te vayas, no te vayas así.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and on Quick Take by Bloomberg. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We're off session highs, well off session highs, but it is an up day here, 12-week high, 4-day rally on the S&P 500 index. Data showing the economic damage from the coronavirus pandemic is less severe than anticipated. It is the S&P 500's longest rally since early February, up today by another 21 points, now at 3,057. That is a gain of 0.7%. Nasdaq up 56, up 0.6. The Dow up 100 points, higher by 0.4%. 10-year down 6/32 with a yield of 0.70%. Gold up 0.3%, 17.14 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up now by 2.9%. $33.75 a barrel. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, really appreciate that update. Charlie Pellet there with the Bloomberg Business News Flash. Well, nobody really knows what cities are going to look like on the other side of the COVID crisis. So many questions. Will there be an exodus to the suburbs? Who's going to ride public transit again? And will independent retailers survive? Those are just some of the questions out there. There are many. And as we all figure this out together, those questions and those answers are part of a new feature in Bloomberg Business Week magazine. Let's talk about that with Bloomberg Business Week Global Economics Editor Christina Lindblad. She is on the phone in Brooklyn. And then Noah Buhire, he's finance reporter at Bloomberg News. He joins us on the phone in Seattle. But Christina, first of all, so good to have you here. How are you?
Good, I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
And your family's doing okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Struggling through math, but
yeah, I know. I'm struggling through math. I know it's very different. I love that you guys are doing this feature because Jason and I talk with a lot of CEOs, leaders in all walks of life, and we're all trying to figure out what life looks like, on the other side of this. So tell us about the thinking about this feature series, how it all came about.
Well, I from the beginning, we wanted to tell the story of a place not just as a one-off, but to sort of embed in a community so we could, because we knew that it was going to be several months before, and now, like we said, almost a year or more before we knew what were there going to be scars, because at first we all thought May will bounce right out of this and be able to reopen. And we actually have to say we circulated something like 5 memos because each person there was a lot of heart. I think reporters wanted to cover places that were near and dear to them. So, but we finally settled on this corridor in Seattle, and I'm going to have, Noah can tell you why.
Yeah, so Noah, come on in here because this is, I mean, first of all, I know we're not supposed to pick favorites, but you're one of our favorites. I love reading your stuff and seeing the way you take this on. So how do you get your arms around in the best way possible and looking to the long term this one neighborhood in your town?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jason, and thanks for saying that. There were a lot of neighborhoods I could have chosen from in Seattle, which, as a lot of people know, is the first coronavirus hotspot in the U.S. The reason we ended up going with this particular corridor is that there's just a really interesting range of businesses. It's got a lot of nightlife, but it's a neighborhood that's really vibrant in all hours. And there's a lot of small business, but there's also a presence from some of the big corporations in Seattle. Starbucks, for instance, has its Reserve roastery on Capitol Hill in this Pike Pine corridor. It's a very experiential place for people to enjoy coffee, see how it's roasted, and so forth. Amazon also, in February, sort of amazingly, right before social distancing went into effect, opened their first cashierless grocery store in this area. So we just felt like there was an interesting tapestry and just a lot of interesting people with different stories that tap into parts of Seattle history and the broader cultural history of this city that would be good to explore as this crisis unfolds.
Christina, I think this is what's great about the magazine. Like, we have been covering some of the bigger stories and some of the big companies and industries that have been impacted, but also really digging down into smaller businesses, communities, who've really been impacted severely by the virus, and, really helps us kind of figure out, what is the way forward and what the future looks like, especially at a time when we have so little, you watch the global economy, we have so little visibility right now.
Yeah, it is hard to know, and I think it's a difficult situation, but I'm happy to see all the attention that small business is getting, nationwide and from Washington. Although, the difficulties are well documented about the accessing loans, but because, for a long time, sometimes, it's the big companies that are in the foreground of our coverage, right? And I think this has pushed, all these other businesses now to the foreground, and we're looking at how it's an ecosystem, right? Yeah. How even in a place like Seattle, the technology jobs, those high salaries, support this whole ecosystem of small businesses.
Well, and Carol mentioned that we've been talking to a lot of CEOs, which is absolutely true. And we've also, had the good fortune to talk to a lot of restaurateurs, Noah, and man, what a reminder of the fragility of the food business and the dining business. And, tell us about this one bistro that you visited, because it's an amazing kind of microcosm of what so many restaurateurs and small businesses are facing.
Yeah, just to clarify, I didn't visit it. We've tried to observe social distancing to get this project off the ground.
Virtually visiting. We use visit in the broadest sense here, Noah.
So the restaurant is called Plum Bistro. It's run by and owned by a woman named McKinney Howe, who designs really interesting plant-based menus, so a lot of vegan dishes. And she was one of the lucky ones to get in a PPP loan. That's the federal loan program for folks who don't know. She got that in the first batch, and what she did with it was actually really interesting. She realized that a lot of her kitchen staff had experience in construction. So she used the loan to hire those folks back, and they're now in the process of remodeling her restaurant, which is more than a decade old, I think, so that she can safely get people back in there when the government allows dine-in service again.
I think that's really powerful. And just the conversations, those people who are pivoting quickly. We've talked to high-end even restaurants, right, who said, you know what, we never used to do takeout or curbside, and we're now realizing that might be a new revenue stream that stays with us once we reopen. So I do think, she's smart in terms of pivoting quickly, feeling, what the environment is and what the changes might be. So it was good to hear her story, and I know more stories to come in the future in the magazine as part of this feature series. Noah, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Noah Buhire, finance reporter at Bloomberg News, on the phone in Seattle. Christina Lindblad, she's our global economics editor at Bloomberg Business Week. So be sure to check out online and in the magazine, certainly this week and in weeks to come, these stories. I think these are important to tell. And I love how people are saying, all right, let me figure out, how do I do this?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I think it's also interesting to tell the story through one neighborhood, because this, we know, is not something that is going to snap right back. I mean, we hear about V-shaped recoveries and things like that, but we know in our bones that behavior is going to change. We're talking about human beings here, and maybe, yes, we're eager to get back out, but we're also rational at some point, and our habits are going to change, and also the economics are going to change. And for a city like Seattle, which has experienced such a mega boom, in some ways, you have to think about, how this is going to affect it.
All right. For those of you listening in New York, D.C., and San Francisco, watching on YouTube, Bloomberg Business Week, Jason and myself, we're going to continue. If you're listening on Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, Bay State Business is coming up next. And coming up next, right here on Business Week, an interesting conversation about economics and super forecasters, what they are saying about COVID-19.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We move into the final hour of trading with the Dow, the S&P, and Nasdaq all advancing. Stocks at a 12-week high as data shows the economic damage from the coronavirus pandemic is less than anticipated. Treasuries fell. Right now, the 10-year down 6/30 seconds, the yield 0.70%. S&P 500 index's longest rally since early February has pushed it 37% above its March lows. Technology shares that lagged behind earlier in the week are leading today's gains, but Twitter shares slumping on news that President Trump is preparing to order narrower liability protections for social media platforms. Twitter shares down now by 2.6%. As for the economic outlook, Steve Ricciotto is chief U.S. economist at Mizuho Securities.
We're actually looking for an economy that will be back to zero on a year-over-year growth rate basis by the second quarter of 2021, which means it'll be we'll probably mark the recession as beginning in March, so Q1 and Q2 of 2020 will be the recession, and then the recovery will be Q3 to Q2 of 2021.
S&P 500 index up now by 24 points, up 0.8%. The Dow up 131, up 0.5. Nasdaq up 66. That is a gain of just about 0.7%. Well, some of the other stories that we're following for you today: American Airlines Group will cut 30% of its management and support staff, or about 5,100 jobs, as it continues to shrink operations in response to the dramatic decline in travel brought on by the coronavirus pandemic. Among airline shares today, American down 6.7%, UAL down 4.6%, Delta down 1.4%, and Southwest Airlines also down 1.4%. Job cuts at Boeing. Boeing shares are higher, though, today. The playmaker is resuming production of its 737 MAX jetliner while working with regulators to end a year-long global grounding. Boeing shares up now by 2%. Recapping, S&P up by 0.9%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You are listening to Bloomberg Business Week on this Thursday. Carol Massar along with my co-host Jason Kelly. So a group of super forecasters say a COVID-19 vaccine is still a ways off. In today's Business Week Economics editor Peter Coy joins us along with the CEO of that group that pulls all of those super forecasters together. He's Warren Hatch, CEO of Good Judgment. It's a company that maintains a global network of forecasters to make predictions for clients based on publicly available evidence. Peter's on the phone in New Jersey, Warren in New York City. Peter, set the stage for us. I love this story.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, everybody wants to know this. When are we going to have a vaccine? It's a question on everybody's mind now. So I got a pitch, actually, from a PR person about Good Judgment, a company I was aware of, but I hadn't really looked at their website to see what they were saying about COVID-19. I was really curious. And, I was surprised, actually, when I saw the results, how pessimistic they really were. It seemed like they're on the pessimistic end of the stuff you're hearing, but I thought, well, maybe they're right, and all the, companies and epidemiologists and government officials are just champing at the bit a bit too much, getting a little over-optimistic. I said, this sounds like a story, so put something out.
So, Warren, tell us about it. And by the way, I think super forecaster is one of the greatest descriptions that I've ever heard. Like to title, to have the title like, yeah, I'm a super forecaster. Like, do you actually have that on your business card, or is that just something you sort of throw around at cocktail parties? I'm just giving you a hard time, but it is cool.
Well, I'll tell you.
Do you have a cape? That's what we want to know. Do you have a cape?
Well, I think there is a cape on one of our stock photo images that we've used in the past. And I could tell you that the term super forecaster, super forecasters themselves are a little uneasy with that. But now that I'm CEO of the commercial spinoff, boy, I sure recognize the value of the term. I'm all for it. Putting it on my business card is a great idea.
So what did you find? Help us understand, as you guys dug into this, because as Peter, rightly said, this is running, counter to what a lot of us are, hearing and reading from maybe more optimistic folks.
Yeah, so the way we approach these kinds of questions for clients and government and private sector and finances is we think in terms of probabilities.
So rather than saying, well, a vaccine is unlikely or likely or absolutely for sure, those sorts of things, but they're really hard to track, to evaluate, to interpret. So we use probabilities, numbers that you can compare across different kinds of questions. So when will the U.S. economy recover? We're less optimistic than my old friend Steve Rasciuto. But also, when is a vaccine going to be widely available? And then we create ranges so we can get a little bit more nuanced. What's the probability that a vaccine will be in wide distribution by the end of this year? Right now, the super forecasters have pretty low odds in the single digits that that's going to occur. Now, that doesn't mean it won't. In a world of probabilities, if it's low, we may see it. And by may, I mean like 6% probability. So it's not zero, but the probabilities are much higher for a vaccine in wide circulation about a year from now. And I can also say that the pessimism or the skepticism is less than what it was. Because one of the things the super forecasters will do is follow the news flow like we all do, and then quantify the impact of that news flow on their forecasts. And so some of the news that we have been seeing about possible successes in some of the vaccine research has been reflected in that. Now, they're not seeing much movement in the probability that we'll get a vaccine by the end of this year, but a vaccine by this time next year has moved up.
Well, it's so fascinating. Peter, I feel like Jason likes to make references like this is going to be in billions, but I could see this being in billions, down the road. It's like, figuring out what's the likelihood of something happening or not happening. But I do think in a world where I was just in a conversation with a bunch of CEOs, there's just no data, and folks are saying you've got to throw out the old data points because they just don't apply to the future. This kind of information can be very useful.
Yeah, I mean, information, it's not like this is the answer. I mean,
right.
The Good Judgment Incorporated has had its share of mistakes, too. And when I talked to Philip Tetlock, who's a co-founder, University of Pennsylvania professor, and he was the first to say, look, it's rare that we're going to be way on one end, everybody else will be way on the other, and we'll be right and they'll be wrong. But on the other hand, if you're right 52% of the time, in the stock market, for example, you could make a lot of money. So you don't. Again, the measure of success is not perfection. It's just having a little bit of an edge. And I'm willing to say that maybe these people, just because of their disciplined way of thinking, the fact that they're not emotionally tied to a particular answer or financially invested in a particular answer, that they just want to make the very best estimate, makes them worth listening to.
Well, and Warren, we should note, your background is in hedge funds. I mean, you helped co-found a hedge fund. You understand the research element. And so from an investment perspective, exactly the framing that Peter just laid out is, I think, important for people to keep in mind, right?
I couldn't agree more. And I wish I knew, like 20 years ago when I got started in Morgan Stanley, what I know now. Because there are all these wonderful tools that can give you just a little bit of an edge here and there. And it's these little things that when you add them all together can add up to a pretty significant outperformance relative to your peers. And that's what it's all about.
All right. Well, we really appreciate both of your time. Warren Hatch is the CEO of Good Judgment, joining us on the phone from New York City. Read more about him and his firm. He's a super forecaster. You can follow him on Twitter at Super Forecaster. Peter Coy wrote the story in Business Week online. Peter Coy, of course, economics editor for Bloomberg Business Week. Couple headlines we want to hit on the way out, Carol.
Yeah, I want to hit the one on Cisco Systems. In advanced talks to buy software company, thousand eyes for nearly $1 billion, according to those in the know. Cisco could announce a deal for that company as soon as Thursday. So we're watching that one, Jason.
Can I hit another headline that makes me sad?
Yeah.
Boston Marathon canceled in September. It had been rescheduled from April, Patriots Day, till September. The mayor of Boston announcing on Twitter that they will not hold that race this year. There'll be some sort of virtual race. It's a huge bummer. I'm really, really upset for anybody who had qualified to run. Let's get to Bob Moon now. He's got world and national headlines. Hey, Bob.
Jason, thank you. A dire warning from the United Nations today about the ongoing threat posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned world leaders the pandemic will cause unimaginable devastation and suffering around the world, with historic levels of hunger and famine and up to 1.6 billion people unable to earn a living unless action is taken now. He called for immediate and collective action in several critical areas, including enhancing global financial liquidity, providing debt relief, and special focus on tax evasion, money laundering, and corruption. The House of Representatives passed a bipartisan bill to make it easier for small businesses to take advantage of the federal subsidy to keep workers on the payroll. Bloomberg's Irv Chapman reports from Washington.
Republican Steve Chabot endorsed the bill.
Back in March, the covered period was defined as 8 weeks. This bill extends the 8-week to 24 weeks.
Democratic sponsor Dean Phillips cited a plea from, among others, a restaurant owner in his district.
The problem is that because our business is a restaurant, we are not able to open it up fully where we could hire our entire staff back under the conditions of the loan. The complexities of balancing staying open or closing will be determined by what the government is able to change via this bill.
Bipartisan co-sponsors have introduced a similar bill in the Senate. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
And recapping the story breaking this hour, the Boston Marathon has been canceled for the first time in its 124-year history. Organizers announced today they'll instead have a virtual event in which participants who verify they ran 26.2 miles on their own will receive their finisher's medal. Global News 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg. I'm Bob Moon.
All right, Bob, thank you so much. I'm so bummed about that. I'm so bummed about the Boston Marathon. I mean, it really is. You know, I have to say, just to take a moment on this, I've run the Boston Marathon several times, and it's the pinnacle. It feels like the pinnacle for many amateur athletes because, you know, for the most part, other than sort of charity bibs, like you have to qualify in another race, and it is just one of those moments, you know, as someone, you know, it's a marathon and all those different things. And, you know, people train for months and months and months. And, you know, I have many friends who are, you know, who were set to run in April and then they pushed it back to September, which was disappointing in its own right. I mean, it's also been the site of so many amazing moments. You know, you think about Meb Keflezighi being the first American to win the race the year after the Boston Marathon bombing. I mean, it's iconic.
I've been there. I've watched the
ways.
race. It's really wonderful. We've done broadcasts.
Yeah.
Bloomberg Radio has done broadcasts from there, and it's really, you know, that city. I say city/town because it has such a town feel, and it's really such a wonderful event. But you know, it makes me wonder. Right, the Olympics are still pending, and I do wonder what's going to happen with the Olympics. I think everybody in the sports world, and we know this from our conversations, Jason, you know, that will be the last phase in terms of a reopening, and it's just not easy to do and do it safely. Having said that, and kind of keeping with our conversation, a story by Janet Lauren, who does great reporting on the world of colleges and universities and endowments. She put out a story, Brown University revamping its sports program, cutting varsity sports teams as the school seeks to contend with earning just 2.8% of titles in the Ivy League over the last decade. They say the changes don't relate to the pandemic. They date back to a review they started in the last school year. But I got to say, at some point, probably people are like, yeah, let's just do this.
Yeah,
right?
I know.
Because there's going to be, we talk about some of the financial problems that might be as a result of the pandemic and shutdown.
So here's what's not going to be a varsity sport anymore among them: men's and women's fencing, men's and women's golf, women's skiing, men's and women's squash, women's equestrian, and men's track field and cross country. That's a big cut. It's a big cut. And, you know, people still get to play, but not at the varsity level. This is Bloomberg.
Order filled.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and on Quick Take by Bloomberg. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Stocks are advancing well off session highs, though. Let's head right over to the first word breaking news desk for today's afternoon call. Here's Bill Maloney.
And good afternoon, Charlie. Main U.S. averages, like you said, in the green, off-session highs, and tech did overcome a negative start. Dow's currently up 93 points, S&P's gained 20, Nasdaq is higher by 58. The U.S. 10-year yield at 0.7%, WTI crude futures are up 3%, gold gains 8, and transports fall 40 points. Leaders to the upside in the Dow, Pfizer, Raytheon, and Procter & Gamble, while Disney and American Express led to the downside. In deal news, Cisco is said to near a billion-dollar takeover of software company Thousand Eyes. And in other news, Rolls-Royce was cut to junk by S&P. Home Depot hit a record intraday high, and Dollar Tree rose 11% after earnings. Wrapping things up, some of the names pointing after the bell tonight include Costco, Dell Technologies, and Salesforce. Live from the first breaking news desk, I'm Bill Maloney. Charlie?
Okay, thank you, Bill. And to hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg, type Squawk, SQUAWK, on your terminal. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Well, Huawei continues to be in the news, and owing in part to our continued attention that we're paying to cybersecurity, and also some headlines yesterday coming out of Canada. Here to discuss all that, Andy Purdy, Chief Security Officer for Huawei Technologies USA, joining us on the phone from Bethesda. Andy, really nice to have you back with us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
All right, so let's start on the news if we can. The CFO of Huawei, the parent company, continues to be part of a big legal fight in Canada. Help us understand what's going on, and candidly, beyond the legal issue here, sort of what it means for business, what it means for the brand at this point.
Well, the effort against Ms. Meng, our Chief Financial Officer, is part of the overall effort the last couple of years by the U.S. government to carpet bomb Huawei out of existence. And in terms of the impact on the company, the decision involving Ms. Meng and the process for extradition will take quite a number of months, if not years, before there might be a actual trial in the Eastern District of New York. And we have great confidence in the legal systems of Canada and the U.S., so we feel like she'll be vindicated in the end. But right now, this campaign against Huawei, the recent ramping up of pressure on American companies' ability to sell to Huawei, even through international companies, is going to have a tremendous negative impact on American jobs.
You know, it's interesting, that this is going on amid a week or two where we are seeing, once again, heightened tensions and back and forth between the head of the United States, President Trump, and, of course, Chinese President Xi Jinping. And how do you see this? You've got to run your business amid kind of all of this fury, and we're trying to figure out, is it rhetoric or is it going to turn into actions that ultimately impact both China and the United States?
Well, there's certainly been an impact on our company.
Right.
The impact was about $12 billion last year, and we haven't been able to estimate what the impact will be this year. Of course, it's complicated by the added factor of the pandemic. But you look at the overall situation, the geopolitical situation between China and the U.S. is what we're talking about, and that's exacerbated now by the U.S. presidential campaign. So the competition among President Trump and former Vice President Biden to maneuver the other in terms of anti-China rhetoric, kind of a new Red Scare kind of thing, indicates that this battle is going to go on at least through the election, and there doesn't seem to be rational discussion, and people don't seem to care about the fact that American jobs are going to be lost as a result.
And can you quantify, the jobs piece of this? I understand that obviously things are complicated, but in terms of the pandemic, and it remains to be seen what the total economic impact is. But help us understand, you guys have several offices around the country here. What has it meant, and maybe help us understand sort of the 1-2 punch, as it were, of this action and this confrontation between the United States and China, as well as the pandemic. Synthesize that for us if you can, Andy.
Well, in terms of within the U.S., we have two issues. We have the issue of whether or not Huawei can sell to American companies. And right now we're serving parts of rural America. And the other issue is the ability of American companies, nearly 300, want to be able to sell to Huawei. So in terms of our global revenues, which last year, despite all this, were up about 19%, we were impacted about $12 billion.
Right.
But the annual amount that we procure from American companies is not just to serve our customers in America. It's our global market. At its height, we had about 30 or 32% of all Huawei global components came from American companies, and they're primarily in the semiconductor industry. And you can see in the last couple of months, and they can speak for it a lot better than I can, that American semiconductor companies and their associations, trade associations, have basically been saying, look, the limitations on the ability of American companies to sell to Huawei is averaging about $12 billion a year. That is estimated to be between 40 and 50,000 direct jobs, not to count the indirect jobs. And so the fact is, we're fighting for our survival. We're going to be okay, and we would like to continue to buy from American companies, and I, as an American, want to be able to see those jobs continue. If we have to, we'll go elsewhere, and then we won't come back, and those American jobs will go away, and that's not going to help America. And in the long term, it's not going to hurt Huawei. And the strategy, you talk about the bigger picture, the strategy is that the U.S. wants to hurt Huawei to hurt China because they are afraid of the rise of China economically and militarily. So that's really at the heart of it. And so instead of promoting greater innovation technology by America, they're trying to hurt Huawei. And that's not going to help America vis-a-vis China in terms of a long-term competition, which is very important.
Andy, to be fair, and unfortunately we've only got about 45 seconds here, but I mean, nothing ever happens in a vacuum, right? And I know as part of the latest, trade agreement, China was supposed to be buying a certain amount of energy products and so on and so forth, and that isn't necessarily happening. And you see China now, in terms of what it's doing in Hong Kong, there's a lot of uncertainty and moves on both sides. What's the responsibility of China in all of this? And unfortunately, just got about 30 seconds here.
Well, I mean, we're independent of the China government. We're a independent company, probably the largest privately owned company in China.
Right.
And so we can contribute to competition and job growth. So the conduct of the China government is different than us. And I may not like what they do, and I may not like what the U.S. government does, but that's separate from us.
Well, I wish we had more time. And Andy, you've been so gracious to, keep coming back so we can continue this conversation. So I look forward to engaging with you in the future. Andy Purdy at Huawei Technologies USA. This is Bloomberg.
Broadcasting live to New York, Bloomberg 1130. To Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 99.1. To Boston, Bloomberg 1061. To San Francisco, Bloomberg 960. To the country, Sirius XM Channel 119. And around the globe, the Bloomberg Business app and BloombergRadio.com. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
Well, coming up, we're going to hear from Dave Wilson. He's going to talk about trucking. You're so excited.
I am excited because it tells you a lot about the economy, or potentially can. And this is happening as we're seeing stocks take a little bit of a leg down. We've got a bit of a mixed trade right now, little changes overall. So let's actually bring back Charlie Pellet. Let's talk about those numbers,
well,
Charlie.
Let's talk about those numbers indeed. Last update told you we were higher with the Dow, the S&P, and Nasdaq all in the green. Not the case right now. 22-point drop in the Dow, just turning negative, down now by 0.1%. 28 minutes to go ahead of the closing bell. We've got the S&P up 7, up 0.2%. Nasdaq up 8, up by 0.1%. Stocks paired gains after President Trump said he would be holding a press conference tomorrow to discuss China potentially stoking tensions between the world's two largest economies. The 10-year down 5/30 seconds with a yield of 0.69%. We've got gold up 0.5%, 17.17 the ounce. Crude oil up 1.9%. West Texas Intermediate crude now at $33.41 a barrel. American Express says it's shifting hundreds and hundreds of its employees and its sales units to handle collections and other credit work, and plans to set aside more for loan losses this quarter. Shares of American Express down now by 2.8%. Also, some of the other stories we're following. Credit Suisse Group is preparing a review of one of its most profitable business areas under new CEO Thomas Gottstein after taking a hit on loans to its richest clients. UBS shares down now by 0.6%. Toll Brothers surging after the company posted profit that beat estimates. Toll shares right now, they have just turned lower. As a matter of fact, we've got Toll down 52 cents, $32.50 right now on shares of Toll. 3:33 on Wall Street. Time now for the Small Business Report, and here's John Tucker.
The American Camp Association estimates there are 14,000 camps in the U.S. Most of them are small businesses like Apple Farm Arts and Music Center in Elmer, New Jersey. For this nonprofit, the pandemic means no summer camp for kids. Executive Director Corey Solomon is with us now. Corey, this is heartbreaking.
It sadly doesn't seem like a reality that is safe. And ultimately, as a summer camp director, we always start with trying to make sure our kids and the families, that they're safe. And we don't have enough information. Even with the guidelines that have been rolled out, the CDC and the American Camping Association has put out a lot of information. But with so many unknowns about this virus still and how it affects children and what's going to happen with this a second wave, and living in an intimate environment like a residential camp where we have 350 people sleeping and eating and, playing together, it's not a reality that I think will happen. So sadly, we are planning to cancel the summer, which would be the first summer we don't have camp in 60 years.
In terms of the money that you got, the reservations, how does that work?
That's the part of this that makes it financially so difficult, because most of our families register for camp at the end of the summer for the following summer, and then they pay quarterly payments leading up to that. So we've already collected, several hundreds of thousands of dollars in tuition. What we're trying to do now is figure out the best options to make sure that we do right by our families, because those relationships ultimately are the most important, but also make sure that we can make it through to next summer still. So we're providing families with the option to roll over their camp tuition to next summer, which would be the most helpful financially for us, outside of donating the money, which is, of course, ultimately the best choice for the organization. But of course, not all families are in a position to be able to do that. And then the third option would be that they do get a refund.
Corey Solomon, Executive Director of Apple Farm Arts and Music Center in Elmer, New Jersey. Best of luck. Thanks for being with us. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Small Business Report.
And we thank you very much, John Tucker. Nasdaq down by a point right now. S&P holding on to a 3-point gain barely. The Dow down 56. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thanks so much. You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week right here on Bloomberg Radio. Called this at the top of the show.
Totally.
I said Grateful Dead.
I love the
Knew it
Grateful
was
Dead.
coming.
Let's
cruise into a little Thursday afternoon here with Dave Wilson. Trucking, it is one of Carol's favorite things.
It was my first concert.
Oh, the Grateful Dead?
My brother, who was a total deadhead, would travel all over the place.
Yeah.
Had a Jerry Garcia doll hanging in his car.
Wow.
Yeah, he was kind of all in on it. Anyway, he took me and my best friend to a Dead concert. It was great. It was quite an experience.
I bet it was quite an experience. All right, Dave Wilson, before we lose Carol Masser completely, yesterday we lost her to ice cream. Today we lose her to Grateful Dead reminiscing. Talk to us about the trucking industry in your chart.
Well, Jason, in fairness, and we kind of lost you yesterday to Tom Petty. I figured it was
True.
Carol's turn.
Dave Wilson, I adore you. I really do. You're just such a good guy.
You keep it fair, Dave.
I know.
You do.
I know you do.
You do.
All right. So let's talk trucks.
Well, the trucking was sort of an obvious choice because of the nature of the chart. And it's something that came to my attention because Matt Maley, who's the chief market strategist at Miller Tabak, referred to trucking stocks in a note he had out yesterday as being an area of strength to the point where perhaps it's an economic indicator that things may come around sooner and much more strongly than many people anticipate after the recession that we've basically fallen into at this point. And to kind of show what's going on there, because there's been so much focus when you look at transportation on the airlines and the way that they've been hurt, and it kind of obscures what's happening elsewhere within the transportation industry. So what I did was take the S&P Composite 1500 index, pretty broad-based. I mean, there are only 2 truckers in the S&P 500, so I figured might as well get a broader group, and then compare that with other elements within the S&P transportation categories, specifically looking at railroads, air freight and logistics companies, and airlines. And when you run the numbers, you find out that over the past 12 months, at least the 12 months ended yesterday, the S&P Composite Trucking Index was up 39%. And in fact, had made back its losses in February and March as stocks were falling, and set records the last 2 days. So if it's up today, you're talking 3 in a row. Now, you compare that with the railroads and the air freight companies, they're both up about 1% in the last 12 months. And the railroads, were holding their own. The air freight was holding its own. Airlines, down 47%. So the transportation index was actually lower because of the weakness in the airlines. And so, trucking companies, I mean, you're talking about shipping goods here, there, and everywhere. And the idea that this group would not only hold up over the last 12 months, but basically bounce back from, the bear market we saw in February and March, well, it is telling. I mean, and we'll see how much economic significance it has, but it's certainly something that caught Maley's attention. If you want to know more, folks, send me an email. I'll get you the chart, the explanation that goes with it, and everything I do going forward. The email address is dwilson@bloomberg.net. That's dwilson@bloomberg.net.
All right, Dave Wilson, thank you so much. World and At. Now let's go to Bob Moon.
Very much. They are trying to get a handle on the violence in Minneapolis. Mayor Jacob Frey responding to violent protests that have brought death and destruction to the streets of Minneapolis after an out-of-work security guard was killed by police officers on Monday. On the activity seen over the past few nights, the mayor says he believes in Minneapolis. At a press conference today, he said over the next few days there will be an all-out effort to restore peace in Minneapolis.
I've authorized a unified command structure that allows our Chief Arredondo to utilize resources, personnel from other jurisdictions. We've requested assistance from the state, and we are thankful to the governor for the support.
There have been 2 straight nights of violence in Minneapolis. A statement of compassion from the president today, which led reporters to ask White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany why it took the president until this morning to acknowledge the U.S. COVID-19 death toll reaching 100,000.
The president recognized that landmark before we even hit it. The president, that was, after all, it was the impetus behind him lowering the flag to half staff. He did that for several days, and that was an acknowledgement of that number approaching, and he acknowledged it in a tweet this morning.
Global news, 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg. powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Bob Moon.
Thanks, Bob. Carol Messer, I learned things about you. You know, we hear these little stories about your childhood, going to dead shows, and
just because I wrote that to you doesn't mean that that's what I did. I'm just saying. No.
Who's to say?
As Will Kelly would say, I was a really good girl. I really was.
Yeah.
Still am.
All right.
For whatever that means.
There was a noticeable pause there. All right. Financial hiring getting tougher. Everything's on Zoomy Zoom and Google Meets and all the platforms. But, you know, when you're hiring someone, you do kind of want to look them in the eye. I mean, I remember, this is going now weeks back, but remember Henry Cornell was saying that, you know, when he was doing a private equity deal, well-known private equity investor, launched Goldman Sachs in Asia. You know, he's a guy who said to us, he said, yeah, I got on a plane. I flew to Chicago. I sat, 10 feet apart from somebody, but I wanted to look them in the eye because we're about to do a big deal.
Right. That's right. Like, you think about it. But we're also living in an environment where we've talked with a CEO out in Arizona where people were buying homes without really even walking through them.
Yeah.
So much for kicking the tires or checking out, the layout of a home. So it's a different environment. So this story, as you said, Tom Metcalf, Suzanne Woolley, and Felipe Marquez about financial hiring. And in this era where you're doing everything virtually and online, but people are having to do it and figure out, how they get a good feel of somebody in these platforms.
Yeah, and, you do wonder whether this sticks, whether you start to use technology in a different way going forward. I mean, listen, there's a lot less cost associated with this in terms of, especially if you're talking about putting somebody in a plane, putting them up at a hotel, getting them there, if people are going to be working remotely. Like, this does feel like one of these areas where it really could change. And I also think we're starting to get to the point where we do pick up on more things on a video call. We're getting more experienced with it, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting is they point out that even doing things virtually doesn't mean it's going to be quicker. For new recruits, a remote hiring process is typically more exhaustive. So FYI, everybody, this is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and on Quick Take by Bloomberg. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Worst level of the day, 13 minutes to go ahead of the closing bell. Stocks paired gains after President Trump said he will be holding a press conference tomorrow to discuss China, potentially stoking tensions between the world's two largest economies. The Dow now down by 93 points, a drop of 0.4%. S&P down by a point at 3,034, giving up earlier gains. Nasdaq also lower, down now by 24 points, lower by 0.3%. 10-year down 4/30 seconds, looking at a yield of 0.69%. Gold is up 0.5%, 17.18 the ounce, and crude oil, West Texas Intermediate crude, up 1.8%. 33.39 a barrel. So again, recapping, equities lower across the board. Let's recap the Dow, dropping now to 104 points lower, down 0.4%. S&P down by 0.1. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no.
Who's gonna drive you home?
Honey, please, I'll do the driving.
Drive on.
Excuse me, I want to drive.
Just drive, baby.
It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
on Bloomberg Radio.
It is time for the drive to the close. Back with us. I'm excited to have back with us Doug Sioka, CEO and partner at Kavar Capital Partners, roughly $775 million in assets under management, based in Leawood, Kansas, and that's where we find him on the phone on this Thursday. So, Doug, how are you? How's it going?
I'm well. How are you and Jason?
We're doing okay. Week 11.
all right.
Here we are.
Yeah, week 11. We're making our way through it. What's the scene on the ground in Kansas?
The scene on the ground is good. I mean, it's wet today, but that's pretty par for the course this time of year. But things are good. You know, I think in general, broadly speaking, clients are well. They're optimistic, and I think deservedly so. There's a lot of good things that have developed. I think I was on with you guys in the first week of April, and shoot, so much has happened since then. And I think by and large, very positively predisposed.
Well, okay, until President Trump and President Xi started going at it again when it comes to U.S.-China. You know, a headline crossed the Bloomberg at 3:17 p.m. Eastern. Trump says he's going to hold a news conference on China Friday, and the rally that we saw, stocks went from their highs and took a leg down. We're just a little bit lower, but nonetheless, investors are nervous about this. Here's another big macro story that we've had to deal with a lot, I feel like, Doug, over the last couple of years. Big deal in your world, or how do you see it?
Well, I think incrementally, sure. I mean, you have to figure that last year we did see some thaw of the China-U.S. tensions in coordination with a Fed that had reversed course from its more hawkish posture at the end of 2018. And that combination really lit an explosive broad-based rally. So now geopolitical tensions are escalating. I mean, literally as of the last few weeks, maybe a couple months, and certainly the blame game at the start of the pandemic. But if the geopolitical tensions are escalating, but we still have a Fed that's firmly committed to loose monetary policy, then I think the outcome of that tension point is more than equal and opposite and favors the Fed. But keep in mind, I mean, this is a budding impediment that is likely to be more of a conflagration. It at least is partially politically motivated, right? Because it seems like the one thing that both sides of the aisle can agree on is China is now public enemy number one of the United States, so who can be more hawkish? While Trump's in office, he's not going to miss an opportunity to be coronated that title.
And so do you just sort of stay put and ride this out here, Doug? Or what do you do as you're looking toward, I mean, we're almost to the point where we really are talking about the back half of the year. How do you synthesize this and feather it in with, what we have still, which is a pandemic and a crisis and a health crisis and economy that has largely ground to a halt?
Yeah, the economy has ground to a halt. Obviously, the market has done just the opposite, right, Jason? I think, and the recovery is taken on almost warp speed proportions. And it's really the speed but not the magnitude that's surprising, just given the historical context of the market being a leading indicator of the economy. So you get to the point now when you say we've had
fantastic monetary policy intervention. We've had fantastic fiscal policy intervention. We're kind of in a middling range, right? A lot of the early gains have clearly been made. Now we're at a point of inflection of where does the economy go from here to corroborate the market's move? So are there sectors of the market that still offer opportunity in strong consideration of what's taking place still on the geopolitical side? So it's just another element that has to go into the calculus of identifying strong expected return sectors within the stock and bond markets.
I feel
but
like
by no means do we think it's time to reverse course and raise cash.
I was going to say, I feel like there's a lot, though, Doug, in that calculus right now.
Oh, there's no question. There's no question. I mean, I think, right, there's not only the economic but the emotional. And I think when you go through in that the type of pandemic and the sort of that combination or coordination of fear that we experienced, it made it difficult to compartmentalize and sort of see through opportunity from the headlines, which were undoubtedly and deservedly very negative. So I think that's the thing that people are still struggling with as they look to commit new capital.
And so what worries you the most here?
I don't know that I'd prioritize any of the set of worries. I think more than anything, complacency. Complacency is a problem from the standpoint of false confidence in the curve flattening that's taken place, too quick as it relates to reopening economies, being negligent or ignoring data points that would obviously be in the broad-based best interest of the collective American populace to go very slow. And I think what happens, right, is we all have this pent-up energy and optimism, and again, as I said earlier, with good reason.
Yeah.
But like being very measured in sort of the allocation of our energy and our efforts, as well as the allocation of our capital.
So I'm curious, were you putting a lot of money to get, to work, or new money put to work, Doug, when we saw the sell-off? And are you just kind of marking time right now?
No, a little bit of both. So, like, we put money to work, but never with any, probably in hindsight, Carol, not enough speed, right? I mean, certainly the March 23rd bottom, which is held, we think it's going to hold. It's very obvious in hindsight where it was. Did we back up the truck to equities on the March 24th? We didn't, but in a very measured fashion as it was appropriate for clients and sort of their risk profile and their ultimate long-term objectives. But we're by no means pulling off the throttle, because if you think about what's happened, and certainly when you look at the attribution of the index, well, the S&P is down 6 or 7% for the year, but the average stock of the S&P is still down 12 or 14%. And those are still the biggest 500 companies in the world.
Yeah.
So there's a whole subset of companies, particularly small cap, international, where they've seen considerably larger drawdowns, which we think make for even more attractive entry points.
Yeah, especially if once we get on the other side of this, if consumers do come back, if the economy starts to reopen, with some kind of momentum, we certainly could see something more play out when it comes to the equity markets.
And it will, right? I mean, and you think about, we mentioned being optimistic. Like, we're so optimistic on the science. We're so optimistic on the American spirit. We're so optimistic on U.S. economy 2.0 or 3.0, whatever we're going to call this post-COVID constructs. But there are going to be lots of changes in business and therefore changes in investment opportunities. But we always want to think in terms of marginality. Right? How many people have gone to your program and said, we're never going to need commercial office space again, or we're never going to have an attraction of living in or commuting to a big city? I don't agree with any of those statements in totality, but there are going to be subtle changes to that effect, and those should end up being very, very positive.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point, and we always love your optimism, Doug. It's really good. It's really good to hear. Doug Sioka, Chief Executive Officer and Partner for Kavar Capital Partners, joining us on the phone from Leawood, Kansas. Carol.
Well, a little realism, right? Like,
Yeah.
you do. I kind of got up this morning. I'm like, God, I miss taking trips.
I know.
Like, I was really thinking about it and thought, as soon as we can figure this out, I kind of want to resume that part of our world. So it's just a case of figuring it out, making it safe. And I do think it'll be smarter and more constructive. I don't think people will necessarily, at least initially, jump on planes as quickly as they used to. All right, stick around, everybody. We've got the closing bell coming your way in just a few minutes right here on Bloomberg Radio.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and on Quick Take by Bloomberg. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. There you have it, sound of the closing bell at the New York Stock Exchange as we wrap up trading on this Thursday, May 28th. Folks from Verizon virtually ringing that closing bell. We begin with a headline from the Bloomberg Professional Service. The number of U.S. virus cases up 1.2%. That number in line with the past week's average. It was a down Thursday with the Dow, the S&P, and Nasdaq all retreating. Stocks closing at or near the worst level of the day. S&P down 6 at 3,029, a drop of 0.2%. The Dow down 147 points, down 0.6%. Nasdaq was down 43, a drop of 0.5%. Stocks erase gains after President Trump said he'll be holding a press conference tomorrow to discuss China, potentially stoking tensions between the world's two largest economies. Now, as for the overall market backdrop, Doug Sioka is CEO at Kavar Capital. He was our guest moments ago right here on Bloomberg Business Week.
Now we're at a point of inflection of where does the economy go from here to corroborate the market's move? So are there sectors of the market that still offer opportunity in strong consideration of what's taking place still on the geopolitical side? So it's just another element that has to go into the calculus of identifying strong expected return sectors within the stock and bond markets.
The 10-year down 3/32 with a yield of 0.69%. Gold up 0.6%, 17.19 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.3%, 33.59 a barrel. American Airlines Group cutting 30% of its management and support staff, or about 5,100 jobs. Airlines as a group moved lower today. American Airlines Group down 8.4%. UAL was lower by 5.9%. Delta down 2.5%. Southwest lower by 3.3%. Also, Boeing did advance today after the plane maker resumed production of the 737 MAX. Boeing shares up today by 0.2%. Recapping, S&P down 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Move around. Motion creates emotion.
I feel the earth move under my feet. You move like they do. I've never seen anyone move that fast.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Company's called Movers and Shakers. They cost a little more, but that name cracked me up.
Bloomberg Business Week. Movers and Shakers with Carol Masser and Jason Kelly on Bloomberg Radio.
It is time to take a look at some of the winners and losers, movers and shakers, on this Thursday afternoon. Of course, Charlie, breaking down those closing numbers. We really ran out of steam after that headline that the White House, the president, expecting and planning to hold a press conference tomorrow on China, and so that really took some of the wind out of the sails when it came to the equity trade. So what did it mean for the S&P 500? Kind of an even split. 209 names in the index, Jason. Higher today, 295 lower, one unchanged.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, we're getting a few earnings. Those have been driving things one way or the other. One of your worst performers today, I believe it was still your worst performer, was HPQ. We talked about that yesterday after the close of trading. HP, of course, that's the printer side of the business, the printer and copier side of the business, not to be confused with HPE, which is the enterprise side of that.
Supposed to be the boring side of the business.
Yeah, it is.
Right, the old economy.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of boring. Can I say that? I just did.
You did. Done.
I did. But that was disappointing. It was interesting to get Anand Srinivasan's perspective on that yesterday after those numbers came out. And, you know, part of it is just a little sluggishness, but it does seem to be more name-specific maybe than economy-specific at this point, demand-specific.
Well, and especially this is kind of the, we're really through earnings season, right? And so it's trickling out. Although we have been hearing from a lot of the retailers. In fact, some of them are crossing the Bloomberg as we speak. We are waiting for Costco and Nordstrom. But Ulta Beauty looks like they are coming out. And this is a name that we often see come up among the biggest gainers or losers.
It swings so wildly.
It really does, right? So let's see. Ulta Beauty, First quarter comp sales, this is key. It's down 35.3%. The estimate was for a decline of 34.8%. It's stores, right? Nobody's there. They're shut down. First quarter loss per share of $1.39. The estimate was for earnings of $3.26 a share. And the stock in the after hours, let's get a quick check here. It's down about 2% here. But, everybody expects these kinds of names to have, this is one of those quarters we know it's not going to be great. Stock's down about 4% this year.
One quick thing, sorry to correct you. I believe it was first quarter loss per share of $1.39 versus a gain last year. So that wasn't the estimate.
Oh, forgive me. You're right. It was versus. Forgive me. Thank you for that correction.
The consensus, it looks like, was 68 cent profit is what the street was looking for. So swinging to a loss, almost going all the way the other way, double. So not good.
Yeah, not good.
It's not a good report by
and they're drawing down an $800 million under revolving credit line, and they're suspending their stock buyback program. That's no surprise, right?
Yeah.
This is a time where companies are retrenching. They're trying to amass and conserve all the cash that they have, and so that's ultimately what they are doing. First quarter net sales, by the way, $1.17 billion, down 33% year over year.
Yeah, I believe we're getting numbers from Salesforce. Just want to bring those to you real quickly. We are. Let's see what second quarter revenue, $4.89 billion. This is the forecast of $4.9 billion. The estimate there is for $5.03 billion. So that's light. Salesforce seeing fiscal year revenue at $20 billion, had seen 21 to 21.1. And the estimate for 20.67, so that is light as well. Let's just
but not terrible if you think about it in terms of reining in. They're still going to make a lot of money. Stock's just a little bit lower in the after hours, down about 0.6% here, Jason, and the stock is up 11% so far here in 2020. Let's talk about the VIX.
Let's talk about it. Volatility up a touch here as folks got worried toward the end of the day about China. The VIX up about 3.7%, closing at 28.65. This is Bloomberg.
All right, Dave, you're up.
Hi, my name is Dave.
Wilson, where are you? Wilson!
Just what do you think you're doing, Dave?
We're going for the price on Wilson.
Open up the door, it's Dave! Who? Dave!
Hey, Mr. Wilson!
Hey, Mr. Wilson. Dave Wilson back with us with your stock of the day. What's you got?
I got Simulations Plus, Jason. It's a provider of software that drug makers and other companies use to discover and develop new products. The programs run simulations of lab experiments and model data, among other features. Simulations Plus was founded in 1996 and went public in 1997. The ticker is SLP. Now, the shares rose in 10 of the last 11 years, with 2016 as the one exception. And during that time, they soared more than 31-fold. While Simulations Plus stumbled this year between mid-February and mid-March, along with a whole lot of other stocks, it's surged since then. The rally gained momentum today after the company was picked for the S&P Small Cap 600 Index. It will be added before Monday's open to replace the digital video recording company TiVo, which is being required. Now, once that change is made, funds tracking the Small Cap Index will have to own Simulations Plus. That prospect helped lift the shares to a record, and they also recorded the biggest gain since November 2007. They rose more than 22.5%.
Big move up. That is certainly notable. All right, Dave Wilson, thank you so much. Dave Wilson with his stock of the day. Nordstrom also crossing.
Yeah, first quarter loss per share coming in at $3.33. The estimate had been for a loss of $1.34, so safe to say that's a miss. First quarter net sales down 40%, and that is just a tough beat there for Nordstrom.
So you're going to love this. Stock's up 1.1% in the after hours.
Wait, what?
Just telling you, 1.5% now. So climbing.
Wow. Interesting.
What's it doing? Let me just take a quick look at what it's doing for the year. It's down 56% for the year.
Yeah, so a lot of room to move. I mean, we have seen these retailers swing back and forth. A couple of your biggest gainers yesterday, Kohl's and Gap, were among your worst performers today. So we'll continue to keep an eye on those retailers.
Up 2.8% now.
We're going to talk retail with Margaret Keene in just a minute. First up, though, let's get to Ed Baxter. He's got World National Headlines.
Hi, Jason. Hi, Carol. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio says it is time to talk about gradual reopening.
Because you have done it so well, we're now actually in a position to start talking about opening things up, step by step, phase by phase.
Yeah, he says doesn't mean rushing back, but by the second week of June, the possibility of
restricted to curbside pickup or in-store pickup. That means not wandering the aisles, shopping or lingering or comparing things, but placing an order and coming and getting it. So it's a quick transaction with limited contact between people.
And he says he'd like to see schools open September 10th. Now, the dangers of removing social distancing barriers too quickly, the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama, Stephen Reed.
We're seeing the spikes not only in Montgomery, but also throughout Alabama. And that is problematic for our business owners, it's problematic for our schools, it's problematic for our hospitals, our first responders, and our entire community.
China, Hong Kong. China going ahead with a motion toward passing new security measures for the region. Former Governor Chris Patton says Xi Jinping and China have become an enemy.
He's been throwing China's weight around in a way which is a danger to all democracies around the world. And I think he needs to be called out.
And he says he hopes business can find a way to continue keep Hong Kong a financial hub. And support is bipartisan in the U.S. Nancy Pelosi.
And so we want everyone to oppose this law that the Chinese are putting forth to take away that autonomy from Hong Kong.
And she wants to go ahead with financial pressures. The president announcing hold a news briefing tomorrow regarding China. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter. This is Bloomberg.
I am definitely with Governor Cuomo.
Make mask wearing cool again? Or cool for the first time, probably?
Yeah, or, just part of the way of life. I mean, you and I have been talking about, we have guests on, and retailers and companies that have pivoted to making masks, and you've been ordering from different places. I know we have, and I'm like, I think I'm going to have to put like 3 different baskets or something like somewhere, and we just all put our masks in. Yeah. And it's just like, you have places for your scarves and your gloves and your mittens and so on and so forth. I think it's just going to become a way of life, certainly until we get a vaccine. And I feel like from the conversations we have, we don't even know if a vaccine is the cure-all either.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is, and I know that people don't necessarily like to hear this, but, or some people don't necessarily like to hear this, it works. Like the masks really work in terms of just making a big enough